Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to the second meeting of the speaker series organized by the interest groups of the American Society of International Law and the European Society of International Law. And many thanks to Mark Pollack and Ezgi Yildiz for organizing this excellent speaker series. And today our speaker is Professor Shiri Krebs, and she will present her new paper on the technological revolution in international humanitarian law, a cognitive behavioral critique. Then we will have our discussant, Professor Frédéric Mégret, and after he would provide some comments and questions, we will open the floor to your questions, and please send your questions or comments via the Q&A function on the bottom of your Zoom screen. And before inviting Shiri to present her paper, let me very briefly present Shiri and Fred to you. So Professor Shiri Krebs is a professor of law at the Deakin University and the chair of the International Legal Society on the Law of Armed Conflict. Professor Krebs' research focuses on international law and counterterrorism with a focus on behavioral and empirical legal studies. She has already extensively published in this field, and sorry that we don't have sufficient time even just to mention some of her outstanding publications. Our discussant, Professor Frédéric Mégret, is a professor of law and the holder of the Hans and Tamar Oppenheimer Chair in Public International Law at the McGill University. Professor Mégret's interests lie in international criminal justice, international human rights law, international humanitarian law, and critical legal approaches to international law. Frédéric has already published numerous publications in these fields and additional fields. And again, sorry that we don't have sufficient time even just to mention some of his superb publications in these fields. So now, without further ado, let me ask Shiri to present her paper. Shiri, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Moshe, for this fantastic and very kind introduction. I just opened my slides. I hope everyone can see them. And I'm especially grateful for you, Moshe, and to Anne van Aken from Hamburg University for kind of triggering this project. Thanks to your wonderful book in progress on the international legal theories and the behavioral turn. And so this chapter really started from this task to write a chapter on thinking about potential interactions between critical legal studies or critical approaches to international law and cognitive and behavioral approaches to international law. And personally coming from a more kind of cognitive behavioral tradition of scholarship, I thought this sounds like a very interesting or challenging task. And then I think started to think about this more deeply, I realized that even though I think that these two strands of scholarship have been developing in kind of without much conversations between them, I started thinking from my own personal interest in military technologies and IHL that the scholarship in that particular field and international law more broadly could really benefit from further engagement and discussion between scholars coming from these different scholarly traditions. So because of the shortness of time, always a problem for academics, I'll very briefly present some of the core ideas in this paper, particularly about, how different, current scholarship in critical approaches to international law and behavioral approaches to international law may merge around issues of law and technology in international humanitarian law. I will briefly say a little bit about some of their kind of, I don't know, mutual, let's say, ideas, but also some of the very distinct tensions between those approaches. And I'll end with showing a particular case study from my scholarship on drone vision, thinking more deeply about how those two approaches can come together to develop a sort of behavioral critique of the law of armed conflict or international humanitarian law. So, and I'll be happy, by the way, to say more about the artwork that would be kind of adjoining my slides during the Q&A. So, just a little bit of introduction on the idea of international law and data practices. And in the paper and in other works as well, I examine how different types of technologies and data practices reshape how we think about international humanitarian law or the law of armed conflict, reshaping its jurisdiction through what Fleur Jones would call proto-jurisdiction, in thinking about how legal practitioners and administrators apply the law through various technological or digital means, including automation, technological lens like drone vision, and AI algorithms, including algorithms that are used to calculate, for example, collateral damage for proportionality assessments. And so, so data practices influence not just the jurisdiction or kind of what is captured under IHL, the practices of IHL, but also how we think about compliance with IHL. And here I'll just briefly mention that I think digital technologies shape how we apply IHL through fact-finding means. So we use data practices to determine what the reality is, through their impact on the scope of the legal rules. For example, what type of actions are militaries required to do or to comply with as a part of their precaution requirements, for example. And then how military technologies or digital and data practices impact how we think about proof and certainty in war as we apply these legal principles. So just very briefly again, a few words on critical approaches to international law. And here I think one kind of mainstream of critical studies in international law encompass 12 scholarship, third world approaches to international law, particularly looking at systemic bias in the international legal system. And I think one of the reasons I'm particularly grateful for Fred for joining us today and for reading the paper and you know, kind of engaging with me on this project is that I've been greatly inspired by your contribution in this field, Fred, thinking about or developing a critical approach to the law of armed conflict or international humanitarian law. Some other strands of critical theory that have inspired my thinking in this project comes from post-human feminism, including Donna Haraway, you know, and her kind of God trick, thinking about the objectivity, the objectivity myth, and thinking about how our knowledge is always situated, even when we use some technologies that we tend to think about as neutral, rather than situated in a particular human perspective. And then, and Matilda Arvidsson work in this space as well, thinking about how technologies determine for us a lot of characteristic of who is human, right? And within that, you know, big category of humanity or humans, technologies are then used to determine who is a male and who is an adult and so forth. And then the final kind of strand of literature within critical theory that I wanted to mention is critical geography, including Derek Gregory's work on seeing like a military thinking about and following James' work on state technologies and the way they limit our vision. And so in that literature and in some other, different scholars within kind of critical security studies, thinking about how our technologies limit our view in important ways. And so taking together some of that literature coming from critical theory and critical legal studies, I want to say a few words also about a different scholarship, developing in parallel that also is interested very much in the idea of bias and its relation to international law and international humanitarian law particularly. And so in this type of cognitive behavioral approaches, we have different strands of literature as well, some focusing on different framing effects that legal rules may have. So, for example, the design of the law, the design of a treaty, the particular legal terminology we use in a treaty may influence how we apply that law and the outcomes of that particular legal regime, including Anne van Aken's recent work with Betul Bismarck on rewarding and prospect theory in international law. And then we have other types of literature on bias in international in the application of international humanitarian law, including studies on motivated cognition and confirmation bias or outcome bias, as Tomer Brody and Inbar Levy showed in their study on military proportionality. And then other types of literature coming from cognitive behavioral approaches also looks at technology-related biases. So some biases that are not necessarily that would not affect humans without any regard to the type of information that they receive, but that are specifically triggered by technology, including automation bias and saliency that can be triggered by salient elements in drone vision, in different technological lenses that we use to view reality. So there is, as you can see, and I only presented very, the tip of the iceberg within each of those, disciplines. And so I think there is an important common ground that links those very different approaches together, and that the focus on uncovering bias and subjectivity within international legal rules and international organizations. But I think even though they share this idea that that legal rules are situated and complex, and that they don't just objectively or they're not neutral to the type of in the work that they do and the type of effect that they have on reality. But then they diverge based on different tensions, and I'll just mention three of those. So the first one would be the more universalist approach to science and the Western scientific tradition that cognitive and behavioral science comes from. And I think this is in tension with the more situated type of knowledge, localized knowledge that critical theory and critical legal studies tend to focus on. Then there is also the issue of empiricism, because what the main factor that cognitive and behavioral approaches bring to the table is evidence-based scholarship in international legal scholarship. And I think we got a really good example of that type of scholarship 2 weeks ago with Sergio Puig's and his colleagues' paper. And so I think this commitment to empirical inquiry, and a rigorous one at that, is sometimes in tension with critical approaches to international law that develop a critique that is not necessarily dependent upon our ability to find, empirical evidence or proof to that critique or to any or all elements of that critique, together with some, skepticism around empirical inquiry because facts are socially constructed and empirical inquiry is limited by the type of investigation that we hold, by the underlying assumptions of that inquiry, by the definition that we use, and by the terminology that we choose or select for that particular inquiry, as well as by the questions that lead what type of facts we collect to answer our question. And then there is the issue of ideology. And I think, coming from, the scientific approach to knowledge, cognitive and behavioral sciences and approaches to international law that are committed to, a scholarship objectivity or neutrality in the investigation, while at least some critical approaches to international law, including 12, scholarship has this commitment to a particular progressive liberal ideology that, and in a particular way, they seek to make a difference in this world. Though I think even within critical studies and critical legal studies and critical theory more broadly, there are significant differences on that question of what type of change we want to see in the world. And I think, and this is something that I would really like us to do during the discussion, to think about what type of change we as scholars are committed to or wish to advance. And I think some of the, at least so far in my personal experience, I felt that tension most strongly between, I think, scholars or empirical legal scholars, cognitive behavioral scholars that are committed to identify some specific concrete way to improve existing systems, while I think, and this is of course broadly kind of, a broad idea that is not necessarily true for everyone, but I think generally critical theory and critical legal scholars particularly would find that sort of engagement as harmful for the purity of the critique, and would be more interested in kind of more radical changes to reality, if at all, change is something that lead that scholarship. And I think this is an important tension that I personally am really interested to kind of explore further. And so, based on kind of exploring this tension, I want to suggest that there could be 3 different contributions that critical approaches and behavioral approaches to international law can contribute to one another, theoretically, methodologically, and through the instigation of self-reflection. And so, to very quickly provide an example, I will use a particular case study to think about how drone visuals create this cognitive assemblage, which and kind of borrowing from Catherine Hales on how some of the technical elements, including the type of lens capabilities that drones have, the human cognition itself, including the biases coming from a more kind of behavioral tradition, and the way that that cognitive spectrum interacts between the human elements and the technical elements of technologies or drone vision, in my particular example, can lead to different problems, including human de-skilling, in the way that we then apply each of the core IHL principles like distinction, precaution, and proportionality. And so very happy to speak to different examples in the Q&A, but I'll just briefly end the presentation by providing one example from Gaza 2014. So this is not something recent, but I thought would be a good example for today's presentation nonetheless. And so in 2014, in one of the hostilities, another engagement between the Israeli forces and Hamas, Israeli drones identified Hamas terrorists near a known Hamas ammunition compound on Gaza Beach. They engaged the targets, as the military jargon would call it, and killed those identified as Hamas terrorists. Though, as you can see in the image here, those Hamas terrorists, or those identified as Hamas terrorists by the drone team, were in fact 9- and 10-year-old children playing on the beach. And then the question arose, why were children identified as Hamas terrorists, adult Hamas terrorists, and is there a way to kind of identify the reason for that mistake and perhaps prevent similar mistakes in the future? And so in that particular context, what I take from critical theory, to inform my analysis of this case, has been, focusing on kind of critical geography and critical security studies on seeing, like a military, how drones, just by the mere task of sending a drone up and to identify or detect perceived threat, may then materialize as a threat, even though the threat did not really exist on the ground, including through technical legal classifications regarding who is an adult, who is a male, who is a terrorist. And in that sense, thinking about the limitations of the vertical gaze of a drone, that while it have important capability to show important details to military decision makers, it also limits some details that are important, including the height of the figures. And I use that visual here to kind of exemplify the difference between a view from the ground, and this picture was taken by journalists sitting on their hotel balcony near the beach, and then think about how that same image would have looked like from above. And so while it helps us detect the presence of humans, it has limitations in, providing more nuanced details about those humans. And I think here comes some of the behavioral elements in that critique as well, thinking about confirmation bias, for example, including sending, or tasking a drone team to find or to detect a concrete threat based on a particular intelligence scenario, based on some, we can think about, representativeness or availability bias, thinking about a previous attack, very similar terrorist attack, a Hamas attack that happened in that area the previous day. And then the confirmation bias kicks in when thinking about, reading the investigation that ensued on how those, how the drone team looked at the figures on the beach through the lens of the drone and identified that they were moving swiftly in a particular way that they were trained or that the drone algorithm was trained to associate a particular type of movement with threat. And then we have saliency agency and time, because in this particular case, the drone team had some questions that they didn't have time to follow up around whether they could, attack those figures only in the compound or also outside the compound on the beach, thinking about the boundaries of this compound that was supposed to be fenced and guarded, but then was not really fenced and guarded fully. And then the time, I think this, responding to, how we can detect a threat, and that threat is very salient in our mind, in a way that does not really allow us enough time to investigate questions about that threat fully. So I think, and so in the Q&A, I'm also happy to talk about the final US attack in Afghanistan, targeting a white Toyota Corolla driven by Ahmadi Zamari near Kabul, in Kabul, near the airport in 2021. And so I'll just end here, and really would like to engage with all of you on this question of, can we develop a behavioral critique, and can we have this engagement without really detracting from each of those approaches. So very much looking forward, Fred, for your take on that, and I'll stop here. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Shiri, for your excellent presentation. And now let's turn to Frédéric Mégret for your comments and questions. Yes, Frédéric.
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much, Shiri. It's been a pleasure reading the paper. I think it's an exciting project. I have some doubts, as you'll see, but I think it's certainly intellectually productive. So I guess the first thing I'd like to say is I have a lot of sympathy for people who try to get us to work outside of our silos. And, it's not a secret that international law does operate as a series of silos, and a lot of people are not even aware that they're functioning within a silo. And I think the set of silos you're proposing here to sort of have encourage communication between is an intriguing set of silos, right? So I think, we've had more obvious partners for a kind of getting together. I mean, famously in the 90s, there's a whole international relations and international law research agenda. You can see how that's a pretty natural fit. And of course, we have a lot of interdisciplinary silos that have been more or less overcome, or to some extent transcended: law and economics, law and history, law and literature. But so here it's a bit different, right? So they really are, it's within international law. So I think there's a bit of a narcissism of small differences, that these are, they're kind of really neighboring, but at the same time, quite different. So I think what they do share, I suppose, is that they operate a bit on the margins of mainstream international law, right? So they have that in common. They're not your sort of typical doctrinal approach. Having said that, and to be honest, and you obviously acknowledge this, so I can see, that you're raising questions, right, about how this would be done and whether it's even possible. But they really are quite strange bedfellows. It would be my initial reaction, and I think I still, cling to that impression after reading you. But I think to be honest, there's nothing wrong about being strange bedfellows. I mean, maybe strange bedfellows make for the most interesting conversations. But just for the record, I mean, I think critical approaches to international law, very vast, obviously, but typically devoted to quite radical critique. One that has little appetite or interest for, quick fixes, or even reformism, or even improvement, at the margin. Intellectually and aesthetically quite different. So drawing on social theory, philosophy, the humanities, or just kind of critical theory, generally much more than the social sciences and a kind of empirical model. And then in terms of their object, focus on structures, ideas, not particularly interested in people, right? So I think that's, if you look at critical international, legal theory, 12 approaches, feminist approaches, they're never really interested in what's cognitively going on in any one in particular's mind, right? Because they don't think that's the most relevant unit or level of analysis. The language of behavioralism, by contrast, is obviously one that is epistemologically grounded in the social sciences, that relies on sort of, a variety of sort of quantitative methods that are frankly a bit, alien to critical legal theory. And also, aesthetically, culturally, tempted to see the problem in sort of, discrete terms. It's not there's something fundamentally problematic with the law or all law, but there's glitches, right? It's kind of very glitch focused in rationality, unfortunate misunderstanding that need to be corrected. And so the narrative is, very different, very, I would say, positivist and positive, right? I mean, it's it almost feels, I'm just caricaturing here with some nudge theorist, etc. But we're just one iota away from optimal behavior if only people can be made to retrained to not fall into these obvious biases that behavioral science has been highlighting. And of course, the obsession is kind of with the individual, right? So cognitive means what is happening in individuals' brains. So none of that is to say that behavioralism isn't useful, right? So the glitches, I think, do occur, and frankly, we see it all the time. You only need to go on Twitter for 2 minutes to see how, all the biases are there. But, they're not, and maybe to stress this point, so critically minded international lawyers might even be not only aloof or, not particularly interested about behavioralism, but they might positively be, wary of it because they're not interested in making the system better or sort of improving it at the margins or making it work more like it's supposed to work, because for them, that's always been the problem, right? So, maybe these quirks, these dysfunctions of rationality, maybe they're sort of, better than nothing. They kind of, it's like, like one of the hopes with Trump being president is that for some, that he was so incompetent at doing what he did. So sometimes you kind of wish that, that at least if you're going to have someone implement a program you sort of fundamentally disagree with on some level, then at least, let them be relatively sort of bad at what they do, and let's not correct some of these biases. So all that to say, I think the antinomy is there, and I'm not saying that you don't acknowledge it, right? I think you do. I think I sense a certain degree of ambivalence, but I think there's something tantalizing about the marriage. I think to be honest, there is as a point on the chapter and the writing of a chapter, you make matters even more complex, because not just a marriage, it's, sorry for my French, but it's a ménage à trois you're proposing, because in addition to critical theory and behavioral approaches, you then bring a whole law and technology baggage, which is kind of yet another refinement, right? I mean, I think you could have a paper on behavioralism and sort of law and technology, or just on behavioralism and critical legal studies, but you're actually trying to bring three things together, which at some points becomes a bit sort of dizzying, right? So in terms of your core intellectual target. All right, so having said that, I just want to maybe briefly suggest ways in which I think this is a conversation we might want to take forward. So there's a few things. So first, I think behavioralism is useful maybe as a critique of sort of profane or pop international law, where it helps, for example, criticize confirmation bias or also hindsight bias. So there's a lot of that. It's always easier to assess targeting decisions a posteriori, right? And so a behavioral scientist might say, yeah, you're saying it was disproportionate because you know how many people it hit, but the person, you know, pressing the trigger didn't. So you have the sort of benefit of hindsight. And there the retort to the crit is you always see this as more evil than, or, you know, more deliberate or imperial than it is when, and that's because you have the benefit of hindsight, right? And so you're making things, you're reading things through that lens. You know, the salience made me think of 9/11, but also the 7th of October. So what is that as a bias? So that would be maybe go the other way around, right? That a classic critical international law trope is that we are always more focused on violence that is spectacular and visible, and that typically has a sort of, you know, larger than life size in our perceptions, whereas infrastructural kind of day-to-day violence, the violence, you'd say, of someone being, you know, a child being hungry is less salient, right? So is less you know, visible in responses in war. Okay, maybe so a second idea that I think you suggest, Shiri, and I think is important, right? So one of the suspicions of critical international law theorists is that a lot of behavioralism is a bit gimmicky. So it's you know, it's focused on little cognitive glitches, you know, confirmation bias, you know, hindsight bias, observer bias, etc. And so it misses the mark a bit, which is that for critical international lawyers, the biases, that, you know, they're not glitches, they're completely embedded in rationality, and they're racism, misogyny, you know, anti-Semitism, homophobia, Islamophobia, etc. Right? And so here I think there might be an agenda of taking these forms of structural bias, but using the language of sort of behavioral bias, right? So taking them a bit more seriously, and also connecting structural biases and individual biases, right? So critical theory is interested in structural racism, right? Much more than individual racism. But individual racism also exists, right? So it's not all structural racism. They are also fascists, right? I mean, they are also actual racists. And now they are also in some ways victims of behavioral biases, right? And here I think, you know, in terms of warfare, I mean, I think we could also specify what wartime biases are beyond, you know, racism, etc., which is very broad. So, and, you know, I could think of a few. So a bias in favor of military lives over enemy civilian lives, right? A bias of lumping together civilian populations and combatants. A bias of generalizing some incidents to spectacular incidents to then make them into overarching strategies. The example that comes to mind here is human shields, right? So there are cases of human shielding, but, you know, as Gordon and Perugini have shown, most of the instances of human shielding are just proximity shielding. So just that, you know, people happen to be in a city where war is happening. And so here, you know, the bias is that the spectacular incidents then get elevated to basically the defining feature of what the other side is doing. I should probably finish here. I'll just maybe suggest one last one, which is turning the behavioral critique on international law more generally, and including critical international lawyers. How would that look like? So one, you know,
Frédéric, we to let some time to Shiri to answer. So please.
Sure. Okay, so I mean, I'll just conclude that, you know, international law is constantly producing reality, right? And it doesn't know that it's producing reality, right? So it's constantly looking for the state, not realizing that it's for one producing the state. And, you know, I think critical international lawyers have also obviously their own biases, right? I mean, you know, if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. If your thing is colonialism, then you can reinterpret, absolutely everything with that in mind. And, sometimes one obviously has to check oneself for these biases. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Frédéric. Okay, we have already one question from Mark. So, Shiri, would you like first to answer to Mark, or you want first to respond to Frédéric, as you wish?
Let's take, as many questions, and then if I have time, I'll respond to Fred. And thanks, Fred. I appreciate everything.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah. Okay, so we have one question by Mark. Would you like me to read, or you can read it, or let's...
So would you mind?
I have also a question, but I don't know. Okay, I'll present my question, then you can answer both of them. One of the interactions between 12 approaches to international law and behavioral cognitive studies, it is about narratives. And in one of the most interesting sections in your paper, you addressed the issue of contested narratives in IHL. I mean, mainstream narratives and counter narratives. So important. I mean, one option that it is about legitimacy. I mean, that one narrative is more likely to gain or undermine legitimacy. But with regard to cognitive process, if we adopt some narrative, is it likely to affect our interpretation of some legal provisions? Or if we adopt another narrative, is it likely to affect our perception or memory of facts? I'm asking. I don't know.
Thanks, Moshe. And I think the narrative question.
Yes,
yep.
Please.
I think the narrative question was really kind of at the core of my thinking about this. Coming from a more kind of cognitive behavioral tradition, thinking about, as Fred said, putting the individual and cognitive biases at the center. So I was drawn, I think, to the narrative question, again, as coming, I think, from more critical literature, right? But thinking, and I think from the critical literature, you see this as, again, as Fred mentioned, in a more kind of systemic or structural way, how the rules that we have, and I think I cite in the paper, recent works, including, Sam Moyn's Humane, thinking about the structure of IHL and how, it basically reflected the interests of more powerful Western countries at that time. But at the same time, I think narratives and the way that they are perpetuated have a lot to do with individual actors and the way they, understand the system. And I think partly that kind of traditional canonical narrative of international humanitarian law as a humanitarian, kind of limiting suffering in war, rather than legitimizing violence, I think it really impacts, military processes. It impacts individuals as they apply the rules. It impacts how we interpret principles like a principle of proportionality. And so that was exactly why I wanted to bring critical and behavioral approaches together, because I think that looking at kind of cognitive elements supplements or contributes to the structural bias analysis, because of the way that structural bias is performed and perpetuated through humans and their, limited cognition. And so for me personally, my interest in this whole kind of project was sparked by thinking personally on critical or on critique of IHL that I was inspired by and agree with, and was interested to kind of be able to detect that bias as, IHL is performed in concrete cases. And so I think I'll end here. So yeah, we can take on additional questions.
Thank you very much. Okay, you want to try to answer to Mark first or to Ezgi, or you want some minute? I mean, I can ask something, Frédéric, for the time.
So let me, maybe I'll just read it aloud for everyone and then I'll respond. So Mark is saying, Shiri, I like your articulation of the theoretical, methodological, and ideological tensions between critical and behavioral approaches. And I find very compelling your idea that the two approaches can best meet over a concrete empirical problem like your case study. Looking at your suggestions for critical behavior dialogue, some of these take the form of putting the methodological tools of behavioralism at the service of critical agenda, but you also go in the other direction, suggesting that behavioralists can better contextualize their analysis, taking account of structural elements and historical context that shape and construct individual actions. Given the widespread view that behavioralist experiments often lack such context, I wonder if you could say a bit more about how behavioralists might introduce such structural power-based context to their studies. So that's a great question, Mark. Thanks for allowing me to speak to that as well. And as someone who kind of utilizes experiments in my own work, I have, grappled with that sort of criticism or critique often. And so I think, and what I see now, both in my personal work, but in others as well, is a move somewhat away from the traditional way to run experiments with either students in the more kind of psychological psychology traditions. And then we had like the political sciencey tradition of, having lay people with like thousands of participants as a way to kind of have a little more robust, sample than, your class students at the university. And then I think, while this may still be useful, and I still use these methods, often to even pretest some of my hypotheses, we also see behavioralists looking more at fielding experiments with actual decision makers. Now, this has its own challenges, of course. And one of the challenges we often have is that, our sample sizes go back down. But then it allows us to, put that kind of intervention and test this a particular intervention with decision makers, whether I know Anne van Aken and Tomer Brody have this experiment they do with humanitarian workers, and Anne and I have now a project where we aspire to field experiments on the impact of drone vision with actual military participants. And so I think while this type of method has its limitations, we are in the development, of kind of better methods or improved methods. And I think, this is partly why I think this engagement is useful, because I think the critique and thinking about, lessons from criticals or kind of insights, I would say, from critical approaches to international law helps improve some of the methods that we use, think about the limits of what we can show. But even with that in mind, I think it helps me personally to refine my findings or the interpretation of my findings, because being more aware of some of the limits of my findings, helps contextualize their meaning. So perhaps we can and complement, and this is something I've done with other studies as well, complementing behavioral studies or experiments with interviews with actual decision makers, or different, type of contextualizations. And so, I could talk an hour probably about, improving methods, of experimenting. But I'll just, leave that there as, agree that this is, never perfect. But for me, this engagement is always about saying more or being more nuanced or complex about the type of finding that I have. So and I think learning from both critical and behavioral studies, I think this is a move away from simplicity and simplification and towards more kind of complex and diverse voices.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Shiri. We have another question. I don't know if you want to read it or you have quite a lot of work. Yeah.
Okay, so the next question is from Ezgi. Thanks, Ezgi. Thank you for the great paper and presentation. You mentioned that legal scholars and cognitive behavioral scholars do not look at the same type of bias. Can you tell us more about the similarities between different forms of bias? Could calculated rational bias lead to cognitive ones or vice versa? Okay, so I'm trying to think. So I think in the paper, when I talk about kind of the different types of biases, I think I kind of my intention was more what Fred mentioned before, which was really thinking about kind of structural biases. So thinking about the design of the legal rules and how that systemic problem or framework then leads to particular outcomes that benefit or support the interests of, particular countries, in that sense, typically, kind of Western or first world countries. And so this was more on the type of unit of analysis, whether we look at the system or the rules, and whether we look about or organizations, and whether we look about individual people and how they interpret the rules and implement them. And so I think I'm not fully sure what you mean by rational or calculated bias, but I think so if that kind of corresponds to what I just said, I think that, and feel free to say more on that if I didn't understand this correctly in the Q&A. But I think my point exactly. Oh, perfect. So I think my point was exactly that the type of legal rules that may create this systemic bias can then lead to a cognitive bias because of how they frame the problem. And so I think, for example, in some of my other papers, I argue that the way that the principle of proportionality is framed then creates cognitive or can trigger cognitive biases for individuals that apply this rule, especially because it only cares about, kind of anticipated outcomes rather than actual outcomes, the way that it frames the problems or the way that it kind of structures our cognitive analysis. And in a different paper, I termed this as a law-fulfilling prophecy that basically, enshrines this this cognitive dynamic where your analysis is then, kind of fit with the legal standard that the principle of proportionality poses for us, making this very difficult, as we know, I think from whichever approach we come from, very difficult to prove that or to kind of, use that principle of proportionality in a critical way, saying, well, this was not proportional, or that someone made, or that the principle was violated by a particular actor, because this always, we have this focus on what you had in mind, what was your kind of internal assessments coming into that.
Okay, I have one brief question that you may answer, or Frédéric. Perhaps it is something, some bias of TWEL approach to international law. So TWEL approach to international law emphasize domination and exploitation, as Shiri has written. But if I'm not mistaken, almost always they are talking about Western domination or Western exploitation. Is there significant TWEL literature about South-South exploitation? Just for example, recently there are quite a lot of news about how China employs some strategies aimed at gaining natural resources in some poor African countries. Yeah, so 12 approaches, they also analyze or address such kind of non-Western exploitation. Frédéric or Shiri, Frédéric, you want to try briefly? We don't have much time.
Yeah, no, I mean, look, it's a much broader problem, and you know, here maybe to connect it to Shiri's theme. So here there is a bit of a bias, right? The bias of I think in scholarship of force of habits, and you know, having had to deal with you know, a major central tradition of Western imperialism emerging in you know, in modernity, and so but you know, there is interest certainly in you know, global South legacies of imperialism, and it complexifies the picture a bit. I think the war in Ukraine and sort of various reactions to, you know, Russian historical imperialism have been quite enlightening in that respect, in shedding light on the fact that, you know, yes, of course, Russia has an imperial history of its own. So there, I think, you know, again, I mean, I think, you know, the study of these biases is really interesting to understand social reality in general, but also how we as scholars, as academics, you know, also construct that reality, and how we're obviously not innocent of some of these biases that I think behavioralists quite rightly point out exist.
Thank you very much. Shiri, you have 1 minute if you would like to conclude or to answer to Frédéric. Yeah.
Sure. So I'll just, you know, thank Fred for you know, the really helpful thoughts that would, I'm sure, help me, you know, as I further develop the paper and think more about this engagement. But I think that your last, you know, question, Moshe, and Fred's response really is at the core of my why I'm excited about this still, and that's the you know, potential for self-reflection and then contribution and you know, and growth for each of those approaches, whether we come together or not. I always feel that it helps sharpen our ideas, and I'll just end with this kind of perhaps anecdote that I do some trainings for you know, senior military officers on kind of cognitive biases and in military decision making and technology-induced biases in that sense. And in some of my trainings, I also use critical security studies insights or critical legal studies insights. And I was really surprised at how much senior military officers are very much open to that more radical critique even. And I had, you know, drone targeteers telling me that this really, some of the more kind of radical type of critique really resonates well with their own personal experience. Or, for example, you know, kind of the mismatch between the visual and that comes sometimes the drone lens that provides lots of information, but without the details of the audio that completely changes cognitively then how you interpret what you see. And so I started this, and perhaps I think Fred is right that I have a lot going on in the paper, but this is how it all started for me, with this comment, you know, during some training that I've done for high-level military officers, you know, thinking about how something that comes from a really radical critique on military technologies can then, you know, impact the actual behavior and cognition of military officers as they apply international humanitarian law. I'll end with that, but this, you know, the thoughts and comments will stay with me way longer after. So thanks for joining, and thanks for, you know, engaging.
Okay, Shiri, thank you very much indeed for your thought-provoking paper. Frédéric, your comments were excellent. And I'm also we are grateful also to Mark and Ezgi that have organized this speaker series. And thank you very much also to Taylor and Jimmy and Britta, and see you soon next month in the third meeting of the speaker series. Thank you very much indeed. All the best. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.